Welcome back to Cyberspace, the podcast where we dive deep into psychology, culture, media, and technology. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, a business strategist and research psychologist who explores the complex relationship between human psychology, digital technologies, and cultural expression in online spaces. Today we confront a troubling but important topic: the psychology of white supremacy. As the United States and the world moves forward from the recent U.S. election, it's essential to understand how this ideology not only perpetuates racism and sexism, but also harms society at large, including those who subscribe to its beliefs. In the late 19th century, the enactment of Jim Crow laws institutionalized racial segregation based on pseudoscientific beliefs of white racial superiority. These laws were not just social norms, but were embedded in the legal system, creating generational impacts on social and economic disparities. These historical and psychological foundations of white supremacy run deep in American society. As Simone Gibran Nogueira explains in her 2013 research, white supremacy operates as an ideology that colonizes and dehumanizes the minds of both white people and people of color. This psychological colonization has been systematically constructed and maintained over centuries through various social and institutional mechanisms. Researchers McMahon and Calderaro have traced these origins back to European agrarian history, where hierarchical thinking about living beings first took root. McMahon's 2022 research demonstrates that white supremacy, not just religious or political doctrines, was the key driver behind historical atrocities like colonialism and slavery. The ideology evolved specifically as white Europeans encountered people of different races and beliefs, developing increasingly complex justifications for their claimed superiority. Bonilla Silva's foundational work helps us understand how these historical roots continue to shape present-day manifestations of white supremacy. The ideology persists through what Bonilla Silva calls a racialized social system, one that goes beyond individual prejudices to encompass structural and institutional forms of racism that have evolved in the post-civil rights era. The damage inflicted by white supremacy extends far beyond racial oppression alone. Consider the experiences of almost any Black woman navigating a corporate landscape peppered with subtle yet persistent racial and gender biases. Her daily experiences reflect the layered oppression that white supremacy fosters, even in progressive spaces. Research by Antoinette Landor and colleagues in 2023 demonstrates how white supremacy intersects with multiple forms of oppression, creating compounded harm for people who hold various marginalized identities. Their work shows how even in fields like body image research and healthcare, white supremacist ideals have shaped what's considered normal or ideal, disproportionately impacting Black women. The psychological impact on targeted groups is severe and well documented. According to Burft and Vysotsky's 2006 research, white supremacist ideology typically combines racial hierarchy and other forms of bias, including anti-Semitism, misogyny, and homophobia. This creates what researchers call intersectional trauma, where different forms of oppression combine and amplify their harmful effects on mental health and well-being. Ransby's 2021 work provides essential insight into how these systems of oppression are not just theoretical constructs, but have real devastating impacts on daily life. She documents how the foundational crimes of U.S. racial capitalism, the theft of Black labor and indigenous land, continue to reverberate through contemporary institutions and practices, creating ongoing trauma for marginalized communities. The psychological tactics employed by white supremacist groups bear striking similarities to those used by cults. Stories told by former white supremacists in interviews almost universally recall how the group camaraderie was intoxicating at first, offering a sense of belonging cult members often long for. but they also share that it did not take long before their group's charismatic leader manipulated members to commit acts of violence in the name of the false construct of racial purity. Pamela Cooper White's research draws direct parallels between cult indoctrination techniques and the methods used by white supremacist organizations to recruit and retain members. These groups often employ charismatic leadership, isolation tactics, and the creation of an us versus them mentality that mirrors cult dynamics. Recent research work on cult psychology helps explain how individuals become drawn into extremist beliefs. The process typically begins with exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, often during periods of personal crisis or social isolation. White supremacist groups, like cults, offer what appears to be certainty and belonging in an uncertain world. Recent research by Luke Munn in 2019 has identified specific stages in this radicalization process, which he calls the alt-right pipeline. Munn's work shows how individuals progress through phases of normalization, acclimatation, and dehumanization as they become increasingly embedded in white supremacist ideology. This progression is not instant, but occurs gradually through repeated exposure to increasingly extreme ideas and beliefs. The reach of white supremacy extends far beyond individual beliefs or isolated hate groups. It's deeply embedded within our societal institutions. In a typical American school, for example, textbooks often gloss over the brutal impacts of colonialism, presenting a sanitized narrative. This educational oversight perpetuates a subtle, normalized form of white supremacy, influencing young minds to view history through a biased lens. Jermaine Barnes and colleagues' 2021 research reveals how even architectural design can reflect and perpetuate racist ideologies. They demonstrate how institutional spaces, from courtrooms to classrooms, are designed in ways that reflect and reinforce white supremacist power structures. Tema Akun's influential work has identified specific characteristics of white supremacy that become embedded in organizational culture, often appearing as neutral or even positive professional standards. These include perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, a worship of the written word, paternalism, either-or thinking, power hoarding, the fear of open conflict, individualism, objectivity, and the right to comfort. For example, when organizations prioritize written documentation over other forms of knowledge sharing, they inherently privilege Western educational traditions and disadvantage cultural traditions that emphasize oral communication. Similarly, when systems and organizations emphasize urgency and perfectionism, they often create conditions that disadvantage those who take more collaborative or deliberative approaches, particularly those from cultural traditions that value collective decision-making over quick individual action. In education specifically, Laura Chavez Moreno's 2019 research shows how white supremacy shapes even seemingly neutral practices like bilingual education. Her work reveals that even in educational spaces meant to support diverse learners, dominant white cultural norms often prevail, potentially harming the very students these programs aim to serve. The justice system presents another stark example of systemic white supremacy. As documented by Barbara Ransby in 2021, the legal system's structure and practices continue to reflect and perpetuate racial hierarchies established during America's founding. This manifests in everything from policing practices to sentencing disparities, creating what Ransby termed institutionalized oppression. Perhaps surprisingly, white supremacy inflicts significant psychological damage on those who hold those beliefs. Christine Reyna and colleagues' 2022 research reveals what they call a fundamentally ambivalent ideology among white supremacists. They simultaneously express superiority while also harboring deep anxieties about perceived threats to their status. This paradox creates significant psychological strain. Reyna's team found that white nationalists often experience heightened levels of anxiety, particularly about economic and social status. The ideology promises empowerment but actually delivers chronic stress and social isolation. Those who broke away from a white supremacist group have shared in news interviews how liberating it was to shed the hatred. They stated that they never realized the mental burden it imposed until they formed friendships or alliances with those they once despised, transforming their fear into understanding. The emotional toll of maintaining supremacist beliefs is considerable. Research by Arena and Arrigo in 2000 showed that adherents often develop rigid thinking patterns and struggle with interpersonal relationships. Their work revealed that the constant state of perceived threat and antagonism that's required by white supremacist ideology can lead to various forms of psychological distress. Is it the duty of the oppressed to educate their oppressors? Many argue that expecting marginalized groups to fix or teach those with supremacist views is not only ineffective, but also places an unfair emotional burden on the very people that are harmed by these ideologies. A common response to white supremacy is the belief that through civil dialogue and patient education, those holding these beliefs can be reformed. However, research strongly challenges this assumption. Daniel Cloud's 2021 work demonstrates how appeals to civility often serve to protect white supremacy rather than to challenge it, allowing harmful ideologies to persist under the guise of reasonable debate. Barbara Applebaum's 2012 research provided vital insight into why the civility approach fails. She explained that white supremacy isn't simply a matter of individual ignorance that can be corrected through polite conversation. Instead, it's a systemic issue that requires structural change and collective action. Importantly, Portia Birch's work reveals how even well-intentioned anti-racism efforts can inadvertently reinforce white supremacy culture. She points out that the common rush among white people to get everything just right in their anti-racist practice actually exercises two key characteristics of white supremacy: the sense of urgency and perfectionism. Instead of this individualistic approach focused on personal perfection, Birch advocates for collective solutions that prioritize relationship building and collective learning. This insight helps explain why purely individual approaches to addressing white supremacy often fail. They're often unconsciously operating within the very framework they're trying to dismantle. Alternative strategies are needed. Baez and Orr's 2018 research suggests that rather than focusing on civil dialogue with those holding supremacist views, energy is better spent supporting marginalized communities and building effective resistance to supremacist policies and practices. Their work shows that emphasizing civility often places an unfair burden on those most harmed by white supremacy. The pathways to white supremacist ideology have become increasingly sophisticated in the digital age. Groundbreaking research by Manuel Orta-Ribeiro and colleagues in 2019 reveals how YouTube's algorithm can serve as a radicalization pipeline, systematically exposing viewers to increasingly extreme content. Their analysis of over 330,000 videos showed clear patterns of users migrating from mainstream conservative content to more radical white supremacist material. Users who are regulars on certain popular online forums known for their free speech stance often don't realize how these platforms subtly encourage radical views until they find themselves echoing extremist rhetoric without fully understanding its implications. Luke Munn's 2019 work identifies three key phases in online radicalization: normalization, acclimatation, and dehumanization. This process isn't instant, but occurs gradually through repeated exposure. Devin Proctor's 2021 research on cybernetic experiences shows how feedback loops in social media can reinforce and amplify extremist beliefs, creating what he termed cybernetic animism, where algorithms and AI systems create a fully social environment that normalizes extreme views. Eleanor Boatman's 2018 research highlights how white supremacist groups specifically target emotionally vulnerable individuals online. These groups exploit common psychological vulnerabilities using sophisticated recruitment techniques that combine personal outreach with algorithmic targeting. Virginia Burris and colleagues' research from 2000, although conducted earlier, presciently identified how the Internet would become a powerful tool for connecting and organizing white supremacist networks. The process of leaving white supremacist ideology is complex but possible. Schaefer and colleagues' 2014 research on awakenings, moments when individuals begin to question and ultimately reject white supremacist beliefs, provides hope and insight into the de-radicalization process. Their work shows that just as individuals aren't instantly converted to these beliefs, they often leave them gradually through a series of realizations and experiences. Therapeutic approaches have shown promise in helping individuals exit extremist movements. Cooper White's research identifies specific psychological interventions that can help address the underlying trauma and emotional needs that often draw people to extremist ideologies in the first place. This work emphasizes the importance of providing alternative sources of community and meaning for those leading these movements. Community support plays a necessary role in successful de-radicalization. Research by Reyna and colleagues in 2022 shows that having strong, diverse social connections can help counter the isolation and fear that white supremacist groups exploit. They emphasize the importance of creating welcoming spaces where former adherents can build new healthy relationships and identities. Counter-narratives serve as powerful tools in combating white supremacy. Julie Burnett-Abebe and colleagues' 2023 research demonstrates how counter-narratives can effectively challenge dominant racist ideologies by elevating marginalized voices and experiences. Their work shows that these alternative perspectives help disrupt the simplistic worldview that white supremacy relies upon. Education plays an important role in this process. Wendy J. Glenn's research shows how incorporating diverse literature and counter-narratives in education can help students develop more nuanced understandings of race and challenge their own assumptions. Similarly, Richard Miller and colleagues' 2020 work outlines how critical counter-narrative methodologies can transform educational spaces and promote equity. Caroline J. Sumlum's research provides valuable insight into how white supremacy culture devalues everyone, including white people themselves. In her book, We'll All Be Free, Sumlum demonstrates how white supremacy creates a false sense of worth based on racial hierarchy rather than genuine human value. She argues that this system ultimately prevents all people from accessing their full humanity and their potential for authentic connection. Her work shows how cultivating counter-narratives isn't just about opposing racism. It's about creating new stories that recognize and celebrate the inherent worth of all people. This framework helps shift the conversation from one of sacrifice or loss to one of collective liberation and shared benefit. Community engagement is essential for creating lasting change. Laura C. Chavez Moreno's 2019 research emphasizes the importance of building solidarity across different groups and creating spaces where counter-narratives can flourish. This includes supporting grassroots movements, community education initiatives, and cultural programs that celebrate diversity and challenge white supremacy. Today's deep dive into the psychology of white supremacy reveals how this ideology operates as both a personal and systemic force in our society. As we've learned from researchers like Bonilla Silva and Ramsby, white supremacy isn't just about individual beliefs, but is deeply embedded in our institutions and social structures. From Horta Ribeiro's work on online radicalization to Barrett-Abebe's research on counter-narratives, we see both the challenges and opportunities in addressing this complex issue. Understanding the psychology behind white supremacy, from its historical roots documented by McMahon and Colorado to its modern manifestations studied by Reyna and colleagues, is necessary for dismantling its power and healing our communities. The research we've discussed shows that while the problem is deeply entrenched, there are effective strategies for resistance and change, whether through education, community building, or systemic reform. Remember, as Cooper White's research demonstrates, change is possible both at the individual and societal levels, but this change requires sustained effort, and commitment from all of us. The work of scholars like Chavez Moreno and Miller shows us that by building strong counter-narratives and inclusive communities, we can create meaningful alternatives to white supremacist ideologies. As we conclude the episode, I encourage you to take several concrete steps based on the research we've discussed. First, examine the institutions and systems that you're a part of. As Barnes and colleagues' research shows, white supremacy often operates invisibly through institutional structures. Look for ways you can challenge those systems and promote more equitable practices in your workplace, your school, or your community organizations. Second, support and engage with counter-narratives, whether through reading diverse literature, as Glenn's research suggests, or participating in community education programs. Make an active effort to seek out and amplify marginalized voices and perspectives. Third, be aware of online radicalization pathways. Munns and Proctor's research shows how easily people can be drawn into extremist ideologies through forums and online platforms, such as the extreme fitness influencer to alt-right radicalization pipeline on TikTok, for example. Stay informed about these mechanisms and help others recognize and resist them. Finally, remember that fighting white supremacy isn't about individual fixing or converting others through civility, as Applebaum's research demonstrates. Instead, focus on supporting systemic change, supporting the work of local organizers who have been doing the work for years, or joining and helping to build strong, inclusive communities that naturally counter supremacist ideologies. Share your thoughts and experiences with us on our social media channels and join the growing community of listeners committed to understanding and addressing these crucial issues. Together, we can work towards dismantling the invisible change of white supremacy and creating a more just and equitable society. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off and saying thank you for engaging with this challenging but essential topic. Until next time, stay critical, stay committed to positive change, and stay curious. If you're still here after the credits have rolled, I want to encourage you, if you know that I have mispronounced your name as a researcher, please correct me. Send me an email. I am happy to re-record it on any episode that we've recorded and replace your name so that it's correct. I do my best, but you can't always get it right.